Today on the podcast, we're talking about what I would call like the handbook for family partnership. We're talking with Ari Gerzon-Kessler, who leads the Family Partnerships Department for the Boulder Valley School District in Colorado and is an educational consultant working with schools and districts committed to forging stronger school-family partnerships. He has been an educator since 2000, having served as a principal and bilingual teacher. Ari is the author of the new book, On the Same Team, Bringing Educators and Underrepresented Families Together. This is amazing. Let's get to it. I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-creating curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Ari, thank you for coming on to the Time for Teachership podcast. Welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Lindsay. Thanks for having me.
I am thrilled to talk about your book today. I cannot wait. So I will just say you have a new book, and I'm sure there are other things you want to share about what listeners should know as we enter the conversation today. Sometimes people like sharing about themselves. Sometimes it's like, this is the thing I've been working on and thinking about lately. Feel free to share any sort of launching point you would like for today's conversation.
Great. Yeah, I'm just eager to talk about how schools and districts can deepen their partnerships with families and really create a true space to listen to families and have that kind of be a spark for innovation and deeper relationships. So that's on my mind. My first job was at a bookstore. That's coming to my mind when I was 11. So I've always had this deep love of books. And, I started teaching a little more than 20 years ago and wrote some articles, but this dream of a book has been, full of ups and downs. And I just am so thrilled to be at this point where I can share an offering that I think can be truly meaningful, both for teachers at an individual level, but also for a school community. Because I know there's many books I've loved in education and they inform my thinking, but I don't often get to then go and create something. And so I'm excited about the On the Same Team book because it really gives people a chance to create a new structure for transformative change. It's great to be able to share more about it.
I am so excited to dig in. And I think my first question is kind of big, not necessarily directly tied to the book, but I think you may have even just answered it a little bit. I like to talk about freedom dreaming, and Dr. Bettina Love talks about it as the dreams grounded in the critique of injustice, which I just love that quote. And so with that, what is your big dream for education in general?
Yeah, I love the question. I mean, my hope is that we can embrace a more innovative spirit that really honors the whole child, incorporates families more, and reduces the overwhelm for educators while finding ways to regularly kind of renew the fire and passion we have for the work, and that we can create more connected school communities that are both more inclusive and equitable, and also where trust is this key lever for change. And I know you're a big fan of Bettina Love. The quote that I often share from her that really speaks to the heart of these families and educator together teams is she says, for equity work to work, it must be handed to the community. We have to actually trust the people we say we want to empower to make structural changes, not just tinker at the edges of injustice. And those words and just some of the kind of experts in the field of family partnerships really inspired me to think about how do we create an ongoing vehicle for change.
Yeah, some of the research that you ground the work in are just just phenomenal leaders in the field. And it is just so, the way you set it up, like the intro chapter itself, I'm like, did I highlight and underline every word? Like, it is just so good and like dense with all of that, like meaty stuff, like quotes like that, research like that. That's like, yes, this is the work. And it does such a great job of, I think, making an argument for the do you call it FET or FET teams?
Yeah, we call it
Vet
FET.
teams. Okay, so
Yeah.
the vet teams, I think that is just so beautiful that you're like eager to get into chapter one and like just give me the how, right? Because you've set it up so beautifully. Especially when you're talking, I was thinking about how you named like this is valuable for many stakeholders. It's not just for families, it's not just for students, it's also valuable for educators. And I love the 3-column table that you have in there where it's like, here's all the benefits for each of these stakeholder groups. It is not just one that benefits. So I love that.
Thanks. Yeah, I feel like it's really important. I know time is this major barrier as well as some other ones. I mean, I know teachers feel passionate often about connecting with families, but what was interesting when I dived into the research, Lindsay, to discover that the area that teachers feel least confident is actually engaging with families. And that was really revealing. And so to me, one of the powers of this work is especially in that it's bringing together underrepresented, often immigrant families with mostly white teachers, school leaders, this space for learning across cultural and linguistic differences, and this space where we shift the traditional paradigm of, typically family engagement is one way, and we say, oh, they came to conferences or they didn't, or they came to back to school night. And I have a lot of regrets from my principal years because even PTA meetings and other things like that, I mostly gave updates and talked a lot and then said, do you have any questions at the end? Whereas what I've learned through the FET teams over hundreds, if not thousands of meetings is that when we truly center parent voices and treat them as the experts on their children, as well as experts on how can we as educators get better at collaborating with them, some pretty powerful shifts happen. And as you were saying, in some ways, the FET teams are just as meaningful for the educators because of what comes out of the relationships they build and just all the insights they get from listening to families share their perspectives, ideas. So it's really been this unique structure that in the 5th year of doing it, finally refined it enough to realize, okay, these are the ingredients of a great gathering. Here's how we create psychological safety and trust across all these differences we're bringing together in one room, this one night a month. So yeah, it's been a really dynamic experience that I felt almost obligated to capture in writing so that it could be of benefit in other school communities.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And there's like 400 directions I want to take this down because there's so much good stuff here. I mean, just when you're talking about the research, my mind went to some of the things I wrote down of just things that I literally wrote like, wow, in the margins, because I just didn't know that, like, for example, 73% of teachers believed families were not interested in supporting their students' education or their child's education. It was just like, wow, that's a very uncomfortably high number. And that families actually have higher trust in teachers and educators than educators have in families. It was just like, whoa, like just really shifting that narrative a lot of times where and I think you use that word blame at sometimes, is that we have this narrative sometimes of like the blame, the externalizing, like, oh, if only the families, cared more, right? And there's so much underneath that we dance around, or we externalize the responsibility for, and we don't directly confront. And then it's like, this is what you're talking about with the FET teams, is like, this is how we confront it. Like, we literally confront it, but we also do a lot of the foundation work to create the space where we can confront it versus just like naming things without doing all of that groundwork. So I just
Absolutely.
think there's so much, right? And like in what you bring to the table of like, here's what's happening, and now here's where we go next.
Yeah. Well, and I know in some of your other podcasts, you talk about a culture of partnership. And I think that's at the heart of this work, is shifting from the old family involvement approach, pretty one-sided. The other day, I was reading another book in the field, and it talked about, we're the hosts as educators and they're the guests. And there's kind of this critique then of how are they showing up? And I'll say, I mean, I want to acknowledge, as educators, we're utterly overwhelmed by such an array of responsibilities. That I believe we should have like 2 of us in every classroom to make it sustainable. And that said, like, it does feel like it is about a mindset shift, that when we actually, move from guessing what families want to listening to them and then moving to like co-created action, it's really incredibly rewarding. And I remember one of the other pieces of research was when educators build stronger connections with families, they stay in the profession longer. But a lot of those pieces often aren't shared. So families, I know when I was a teacher principal, at times it was like, oh, it'd be nice to do that, but I don't have time for it. Whereas actually now, knowing what I know, my perspective is more like if you carve out efficiently but meaningfully some time to engage in some of these best practices that we learn from families, it makes it, a huge difference. And I think about, you were talking about how we can be quick to judge. I think about one minor shift, which for every teacher in August, I would recommend is ask families, how would you like to be communicated with? Because one theme we're hearing consistently in FET team gatherings is we're overwhelmed by emails. We're not reading them. They're not coming in the language we prefer. Please text us. And that's been a pretty simple change at a handful of schools that's just been incredibly powerful, as well as just this shift in let's forge a two-way relationship. I mean, I'm thinking about this example of a teacher who told me a couple years ago they were upset when they reached out to a family that they easily could have judged as not caring because they didn't return her call, and when she reached out twice because the young student was absent. Well, she came to find after doing a little judgment, the family had traveled across from Colorado to Texas to go to a family member's funeral, and that was the reason she didn't get a call back. So just this piece of like, can we come from a place of trust and curiosity and a kind of the spirit of inquiry, and make the investment of that time because it just pays off.
Yeah, what a great example. I love all the examples in your book too. And I love that they're often like, here's what we learned when this happened. Like, we learned a huge takeaway from this. And then you have like really great lists of like, here is kind of like all the things we learned in a bullet point list. Do these. This will be great. And I think one of the things that I want to do first, because there's so much in here, and I'm just thinking about the person listening who's like, talk more about these FET teams. Like, first, before we get there, I'd love to just have you give an overview. I know you talk in the book about like who's on the team, what are the goals of the team, and that those are really important. Do you mind just like starting there for us with like, what is this? What does it look like?
Absolutely. Yeah. So vet teams gather once a month, beginning with dinner. It's usually the aim is at least 5 underrepresented family members and 5 educators, including the school leader. At some of our schools, it's more like 30 parents and 9 staff members and the principal. In some of those gatherings, many of them are held in Spanish, which is, of course, incredibly, with 20% of our students in our school district being Latino, it's been really valuable for families to have a meeting held in their language. Just that in itself has shifted a lot. Some other teams and schools hold gatherings in English, and we have like 3 or 4 or 5 different interpreters in the room. So we're still really letting everyone engage in the language they feel comfortable in. And over the years, we've really refined the structure for the ideal meeting. A lot of it's informed by what I learned around social emotional learning in the classroom and as a principal. And there's time for families to engage in learning, because I think one of the big things we've discovered is there's so many gaps we've unintentionally created as schools, especially for families more on the margins, not just the achievement and opportunity gaps, but communication gap, trust gap, access gap. I mean, there's 7 or 8 of them that we kind of explore on the teams. And so we create time for breaking bread together, some learning about what's happening at school, making it easier for families to navigate our school system so they can access more opportunities. But then the heart of the FET meeting is listening to their perspectives and ideas and experiences. So usually half an hour of the 90 minutes is in small groups or back in whole group, really posing a couple questions that'll give us tremendous insight on how do we create a more collaborative, equitable school. And so it's really, really structured in a way that we're fostering relationship building throughout the hour and a half together. So that's kind of the essence of it. It's usually led by a few teacher leaders, parent leaders, who, put a lot of planning. I think just like great teaching, we've learned that about an hour of mapping out an agenda and getting all the logistics ready has really led to success across many school communities, regardless of who's leading it. Just that fosters a gathering that's truly grounded in purpose and meaning for everybody.
Hi, everyone. It's Lindsay, just popping in here quickly to tell you about today's episode freebie. This is from Ari. So we talk a ton about how his book has a ton of reproducibles and lists of things, appendices, all the things that you can just grab and use immediately. He is sharing several of those free reproducibles from his book, and you can grab those at the blog post for this episode at lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/155. Back to the episode. Yeah, it's fascinating to look at the 90-minute breakdown too of like how you structured the agenda and how intentional all the pieces are. I mean, even to the point of, I looked at one of your sample agendas where it was literally like, who's taking on the meals, who's taking on the note-taking task, like, it was so thought out, like clearly from the result of like doing this so many times and figuring out what works, what doesn't. I mean, one of the things, and you started with like, there are meals which is beautiful. You also have childcare for people to be able to like bring their kids. If that's a barrier, now it is no longer. And I'm just thinking now as a parent of a toddler, like how lovely it would be to like, just be like, okay, park the kid, get the dinner. All right. Like we're going to talk now. I'm here.
It's funny. I'm also a parent of a toddler, and I joked with a couple of FET leaders just last week before our break. I said, oh, FET we could almost like portray it as date night for some families, because they're getting a free delicious dinner, childcare's there, and they're getting to be together, and also, of course, build community, which I think in the wake of the pandemic and the isolation and loneliness so many of us in this country feel, that's yet another benefit of creating this space. But yeah, we joked about it actually being date night on top of many other benefits and outcomes.
Well, I think it's a really interesting mindset shift, right? Like we often talk about like how to reduce barriers, but like it's also not even just reducing the barrier. It is like a draw, right? Like here is the free food. Here is the setup where like, not only do you get to go in and talk about, your experiences and like your kids' education and everything, but like you're finding friends, you're finding community, you are fed, you don't have to worry about your toddler for 90 minutes. Like that just sounds beautiful. That's so cool that you create that space.
And you're reminding me of like two, I think, powerful examples. One is on the family front, that one of the 6 main purposes of FET is to build a network between families, to kind of harness their collective agency and build connections. And I was at an elementary school a few weeks back, and a mom had just arrived 3 weeks earlier from crossing the border with a couple of her youngest kids to reunite with her husband. And everything about the school was overwhelming. Her first time in a US school. And we were in a small group, and a mom who'd been at that school for 4 years, also a Spanish speaking parent, said basically, hey, call me if you have any questions. Well, that reduces the load on the educators and builds this wonderful, sense of comadres, networking, and support. And then on the parent educator front, I'm remembering, and I think I share this father's story in the book, where he says, and it hit me hard. He said, as a Latino parent, knowing the principal didn't speak Spanish, I often felt like I kind of needed to hide or be invisible when I came in. And now after, a year and a half of seeing the principal every single time we gather once a month in the FET meetings, having her listen to us, hearing her try to, speak Spanish as best she can. He says, now I feel comfortable to just go up and have a conversation with her. And that opens the door for all kinds of mutual learning, support, connections. So just creating that space. And that's where I feel so passionate about the FET teams, because many events in our schools today are once or twice a year. And there's rarely this ongoing structure that's focused on the more humanizing part of education, not on fundraising, not on other pieces, but really on fostering relationships and mutual learning.
Oh, there's so many pieces I want to touch on here. So one, I know you mentioned this, that Spanish is the language that typically, in your experience, that has been the language of the gathering. And then there is English interpretation. And I love how you even get really granular to be like, and we've learned, like to wear headsets so that it's synchronous, so that we're, being efficient in time, and also being able to like watch and get accuracy for the interpreters to be able to like, just do this. This is how we do it. Like just so many things where a leader might be like hesitant to do something. And it's like, well, it's valuable. And we've worked out like all of the potential challenges. And here is like what we've learned that's just kind of handed to you. I just think that's super cool, all the way down to like where the budget comes from. So like, it could be at the school level, but your district has taken on all interpretation. So like that's there. And then like from like, here's how much we factor in for like the cost of meals. And like, I think you said $2,000 for the whole year has been what you found to be doable logistically. I mean, just some of the things that I think listening to this, a leader might say, great, these are all great like stories and like research based, like we should do it, but it feels so daunting. But you really break down in the book like all sorts of tips, like ideas, literally down to the dollar amounts of like what things cost. You have a whole appendix of like, you want to do team building, here's like 30 team building activities, and like all sorts of things, from like a planning checklist for people who are doing this work. So I just want to say, like, really cool stuff in the book. If this sounds overwhelming to any leader, just get the book and you'll be totally fine. And I also was
Well, and I appreciate you bringing up leadership, because I do think often as a former principal, I know there's this feeling or expectation of the principal has to hold a lot of that partnering with families role. And I think what principals at the 24 schools that currently have FET teams have said is, not only do I now connect with all of my communities more fully, but I'm distributing the leadership. And really, as many principals say, I love just getting to show up, and my only real job is just to sit back and listen. And yet they also are pivotal in helping us, once the team leaders learn in the meetings from families and from their colleagues what changes are truly needed. The principals jump in, for 15 minutes a year, often, of a quick check-in. Oh, let's bring this back and launch this with the staff. So it really is, as you're saying, an easy load on the principal, yet it drives not only a lot of great learning for them and their colleagues, but they're distributing leadership and cultivating parent leadership that can make such a huge difference in that school community.
Yes to the cultivating parent leadership. Also, I love that point. And like, I think you may have said this, but I just want to emphasize for listeners that the principal, you paint a really clear picture that the principal needs to be present at each of the meetings. I think you shared a case study where like that wasn't the case and the team just kind of fell apart, right?
Yeah, I'm grateful you mentioned that. And also, I'm just thinking back what you said about like how granular and specific I've been in the book. I mean, part of what I should say is that we held hundreds of FET meetings over the first 4 years at more than 10 schools. And I learned not only from the successes, but the meetings that fell short, or the couple teams early on that struggled. And so it was really in year 5, realizing a host of ingredients that were key for an effective team, which I've really laid out in the book. And one of those pieces really was the school leader's consistent presence, because that shows to the teachers who, they're coming at night after a full day, usually in the classroom at school. So it shows, okay, my principal truly cares about this effort enough to be there themselves. Not to mention, when we want to enact change, if they haven't sat there in that space and been moved by the stories and insights of families, they're less likely to feel invested in helping us co-create that change. So yeah, that was one of the biggest and most profound learnings in the first few years, because a couple teams really didn't flourish because the school leader wasn't deeply invested in it.
And to your point about change, I think that's one of the big learnings for me in terms of a FET team versus PTA or something like this. Like, actually, I saw so many parallels to the arguments that I make around student leadership. Like, often I'll be like, oh, student council, it's just like planning prom and planning the senior class trip. It's so frustrating. Like, you're just doing these events, but you're not brought into academic conversations about like, how should we grade? What should our policy of AP enrollment be? Like, real things that matter. And that's kind of what it to me sounded like. Between like PTA is often very like event planning, and this is truly, you're building relationships, and it's culminating in or kind of like paired with like action planning. Like, we are creating change, and that's the goal, right?
Yeah. Well, and I could share a couple of brief examples, because one of the things that was really important path of these 7 years with FET teams was, in year 4 or 5, I realized, wow, we're really building this dynamic community. Families are loving the space. Educators are appreciating it. But we're not consistently at every school creating systemic change. We're not able to say in May, wow, the staff is doing this differently as a result of FET. So these last 3 years, I've been really intentional and persistent. And luckily, I've built solid relationships with our FET leaders, where I actually now in January, February, are prompting them with, okay, what questions are you going to ask at this next meeting so that you can devise concrete action plans for January to March so that the changes are in place. And that at one school, for instance, parents told us, hey, conferences aren't very meaningful for us with the teacher. And by listening to them, it was two really subtle, easy changes. One was we added 10 more minutes. So it was half an hour because all the families were using an interpreter, and it wasn't equitable for them to have essentially half the time other families had. And then I did a 20-minute PD for staff on how do we create a more relationship-centered and culturally sustaining approach to conferences. And those two pieces alone led families to come back in March and share having a radically different experience. They also said there's a huge language gap, and we literally put in place this wonderful app, Talking Points, and that prompted thousands of texts to go back and forth the following year in place of that void of communication and relationship building previously. So sometimes it's pretty easy changes because we know teachers can't take on too many more big things. We've got to make them, easy, meaningful, but efficient efforts.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. There's so much that I could talk to you for days about, about this book. But one of the things I'm wondering is if a leader's listening and they're like, again, yes, I'm interested and I will get the book, but I have these fears of it not working or something. What's a challenge that you could speak to that's you know what? Yeah, we've seen this as a common challenge to the work, and here's how we've helped people address it.
Yeah, great question. And you mentioned the team builders in the appendix, and that's one of the resources I'm most proud of because I've for a couple of decades been a trainer in SEL, and those are some of my favorite team builders for students and also for adults. And it's reminding me of one of the challenges. So one of our high schools launching a team, and this was before we learned a powerful lesson, which I should have known already from some of my training, that we didn't gather in circles. And so families came in and teachers had already arrived. They were sitting in a row, basically facing the parents. And the challenge was, wow, everything's kind of awkward and tense here. There's language barrier here as well. And we did a 2.5-minute team builder that brought us into a whole group and led to immediate laughter and immediately broke the ice. And so that is a challenge that for families who've not had this space ever at a school, initially, they might not trust that we're truly there to do most of the listening. They might need to know, okay, can I truly be honest? I mean, we've had to really be thoughtful about building the space month to month that first year. So I do feel like the book lays out all of kind of the map to do that effectively because it is difficult terrain. A lot of us as educators haven't been trained in how to do this deeper work with families across so many differences. So that's a challenge, as well as I think bringing change ideas back to staff and really having a wonderful work with them that then can go back to the team because it's not just families saying, you got to make A, B, and C changes and it just happening. They truly are co-created.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think I'm hopeful that kind of dispels any sort of I'm not sure what this is going to go like. And I think that is so comforting to be you've done this so many times. I think you had said 400 meetings or something. I mean, just so many times.
Yeah.
And that you have seen the challenges, you've worked through them, and therefore consult the book and you'll even see some of those case study challenges laid out and here's what we did. So I love that is a resource for listeners. I'm thinking for the listener listening who maybe feeling a sense of overwhelm of this is a big project and I'm not quite sure where to start. What is step one? They end the podcast and they're I just want one tiny step to get started. What would you recommend that be?
Yeah. I think creating spaces, really listen more, take off that kind of teacher expert hat. And that could be, a welcome phone call to start a new school year. It can be engaging in, a relationship-centered home visit with a couple of your students' families. And I think, diving into the book where even if you don't spark the creation of a team right away at your school, I've really infused the book with a ton of everyday practices and ideas that are really, really straightforward, easy to do. Positive phone calls is an example, one of my favorites, where literally carving out 10 minutes once a week to call 3 families and share some sort of good news academically or about character of a student, something kind they did for another student. So I would say there will be morsels in the book right away that I think are both energizing and very practical.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think to close, I have 2 questions that I like to ask people. The first one is just for fun. It does not have to relate to your job at all, although it can. What is something that you personally have been learning about lately?
Yeah, I love that question. One of the books I'm reading right now is about Zen, and I've been studying Zen now for 8 years. My wife is a monk, a secular monk, and so I'm reading a wonderful book by this author Charlotte Joko Beck about Zen. So that's an area of learning, and I've realized this month, having this time off this last week, when I have more time down the road, I want to learn how to be a better cook, learn how to be a better dancer. Those are like two areas that I felt recently inspired around deeper learning.
Oh my gosh, I love those. Thank you for sharing those. I love when people share things that are not related to their job. It just rounds them out as like a full human, which we all are beyond our job. So
Well, and
I
I'll
think
also add, I mean, as a father of a 15-month-old, like I, grew up volunteering as a middle schooler at a Head Start. I have a lot of background with like 3 to 5 year olds, and then I taught and was a principal in elementary schools for 15 years. But I'm definitely not an expert on a 15-month-old. So been reading a lot about parenting and been excited to see like some of the parallels of what we learn as educators, but also it's been consistently humbling too.
tell me about it. Oh my gosh, mine is 22 months and it is like, I learn every day. I know nothing.
Exactly. Yeah,
Awesome. I am so glad that we had this conversation. This has been so
me
wonderful.
too.
I think a lot of people are going to be like, let me reach out. In addition to grabbing the book, can they reach out to you at a certain location, or are you on social media? Like, where can they maybe follow what you're doing?
Yeah, the best way would be to connect with me or follow me on LinkedIn. That's where I'm regularly posting new articles I'm writing, quick practical ideas. So that's the best space. And folks are also welcome to just email me directly at arigerzon@gmail.com, and can also find more about the book at solutiontree.com/Ari.
Amazing. Ari, thank you so much for joining the podcast
This was
today.
such a pleasure, Lindsay. Thanks for your energy, enthusiasm, and just great conversation. Really appreciate it.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan, from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no strings attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at teachbetter.com/podcasts, and we'll see you at the next episode.